to be together again tonight. Always, I love Women's Midweek. It's always so great to see you all. I cannot believe, as I was looking at the calendar this morning, that November is almost halfway over. In so many ways, it seems like 2020 will never end. And then in other ways, it seems like it's just surging ahead. So somehow I lost half of November. But anyhow, I know some of you are already planning on heading out of town next week for Thanksgiving. So enjoy yourselves. I hope you have a great time. I will confess, I'm a little envious. We always get to go to my mom's for Thanksgiving, and we're not going to do that this year. We are going to stay right here. And so I'll be making a turkey in my Instant Pot, which is delicious, by the way. Instant Pot turkeys. I know you wouldn't think you could plop something like that in an Instant Pot, but you can, and it is amazing. And I will be making a pumpkin pie for the first time, I think, since Anna was born. Is the last time I can remember making a pumpkin pie, because we always go to my mom's and she always does everything. So my job every Thanksgiving is just to sit in mom's kitchen and keep her company. So this year I'll be cooking the turkey and the pumpkin pies, and somebody will need to be sitting in my kitchen and keeping me company. Anna, where are you? I'm coming for you. Anyhow, but just to give you a heads up on some small changes in our midweek schedule that are coming up. So next week, as normal, is going to be men's midweek. The following week is Thanksgiving. We're not going to have any midweeks on Thanksgiving week. And then the week after that, the first week of December, December 2nd, we're going to return with a women's midweek, and then just continue our cycle from women every other week, men every other week. So I know traditionally we start the month off with the brothers, but we are going to start December off with the sisters. So if you need to make some adjustments to your schedule with that, there you go. We're going to be finishing up our time in Esther next time we get together. So we've got 2 more lessons in the book of Esther I'm pretty excited about. Oh, I forgot to share our amazing news. Amazing news. Lamont Frazier's out of the hospital. Not only is he out of the ICU, he's out of the hospital. So by the grace of God, God has heard all of our prayers. He has begun to heal Lamont's body. He's responding to the medication and is progressing really well. So thank you all so much for your prayers. Yeah, it's just amazing. I'm just in awe of how quickly God has responded to that. We did announce on Sunday that we are putting together a meal train for the Fraziers, so they don't have to worry about that for a while. If you would still like to help with that, we would love some more help. So you can get in touch with Juanita. She's putting together the meal train calendar, and we can get the Fraziers in good health and give them a good Cleveland, I guess, well, it feels like a welcome because we haven't really seen them in so long. Or for so long once they moved here, but let's love up on the Fraziers in Cleveland style. So anyhow, back to our lesson, woohoo, after our good news. We are going to have 2 more studies in the book of Esther. Hopefully you enjoyed our first one, which is a really big overview of the whole book of Esther. And we really focused on the sovereignty and the providence of God. I loved it. For me, that was just a much needed reminder of the sovereignty of God. And really for me, just deepening my convictions in that, in his providence in such a year as 2020. That was really helpful for my heart. And then 2 weeks ago, we did a little scavenger hunt through the Old Testament. If you weren't able to join us, I had a lot of fun with that. And we traced the consequences of Saul's lack of a complete obedience to God in 1 Samuel 15, all the way through to the almost destruction of the Jews as a people in the book of Esther. So if you haven't done that, you can trace Haman, the villain in the book of Esther, all the way back to King Agag. He's one of his descendants who Saul did not completely wipe out according to God's instructions in 1 Samuel 15. And so tonight, we're just going to talk about a few things we can learn from the person of Esther herself. And when we get together in a couple more weeks, we'll learn some things, look at some things that we can learn from Mordecai and from God's people. So for tonight, we're just going to talk about Esther. And I've entitled our lesson, More Than Just a Pretty Face. Well, often when we talk about Esther, we tend to focus on her outward beauty. And certainly she must have been beautiful to be even selected as one of the young women to be taken to the king's palace, to compete in order to be the new queen of Persia. And a year of beauty treatments certainly did not hurt her already beautiful exterior. But as there is with all of us, there's something deeper to Esther, so much more of value to Esther than just her physical appearance. And the first thing we're going to talk about today, point number one, is that she won the admiration of everyone who saw her. So at the beginning of the book of Esther, if you remember, we talked about King Xerxes gets upset with his wife, Queen Vashti, and he removes her from being queen. So we're going to pick the book up after that at the beginning of chapter 2. Verse 1, it says, later, when the anger of King Xerxes had subsided, he remembered Vashti and what she had done and what he had decreed about her. Then the king's personal attendants proposed, let a search be made for beautiful young virgins for the king. Let the king appoint commissioners in every province of his realm to bring all these beautiful girls into the harem at the citadel of Susa. Let them be placed under the care of Haggai, the king's eunuch, who is in charge of the women, and let beauty treatments be given to them. Then let the girl who pleases the king be queen instead of Vashti. This advice appealed to the king, and he followed it. Now there was in the citadel of Susa a Jew of the tribe of Benjamin named Mordecai, son of Jair, the son of Shimei, the son of Kish, who had been carried into exile from Jerusalem by Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, along with those taken captive with Jehoiakim, king of Judah. Mordecai had a cousin named Hadassah, whom he brought up because she had neither father nor mother. This girl, who was also known as Esther, was lovely in form and features, and Mordecai had taken her as his own daughter when her father and mother died. When the king's order and edict had been proclaimed, many girls were brought into the citadel of Susa and put under the care of Haggai. Esther also was taken to the king's palace and entrusted to Haggai, who had charge of the harem. The girl pleased him and won his favor. Immediately he provided her with beauty treatments and special food. He assigned to her 7 maids selected from the king's palace and moved her and her maids into the best place in the harem. Esther had not revealed her nationality and family background because Mordecai had forbidden her to do so. Every day he walked back and forth near the courtyard of the harem to find out how Esther was and what was happening to her. Before a girl's turn came to go into King Xerxes, she had to complete 12 months of beauty treatments prescribed for the women, 6 months with oil of myrrh and 6 months with perfumes and cosmetics. And this is how she would go to the king. Anything she wanted was to be given her to take with her from the harem to the king's palace. In the evening, she would go there, and in the morning return to another part of the harem to the care of Shazgaz, the king's eunuch who was in charge of the concubines. She would not return to the king unless he was pleased with her and summoned her by name. When the turn came for Esther, the girl Mordecai had adopted, the daughter of his uncle Abihail, to go to the king, she asked for nothing other than what Haggai, the king's eunuch, who was in charge of the harem, suggested. And Esther won the favor of everyone she saw. She was taken to King Xerxes in the royal residence in the 10th month, the month of Tebeth, in the 7th year of his reign. Now the king was attracted to Esther more than any of the other women, and she won his favor and approval more than any of the other virgins. So he set a royal crown on her head and made her queen instead of Vashti. And the king gave a great banquet, Esther's banquet, for all his nobles and officials. He proclaimed a holiday throughout the provinces and distributed gifts with royal liberality. All right. So I'm sure you saw in there several times, the scripture talks about how Esther won people's favor. So as we're starting here at Esther chapter 2, the whole empire is waiting breathlessly, watching all of these beautiful young women be taken into the palace, watching as they receive their beauty treatments, and waiting until the palace ultimately produced the most beautiful woman in the land to be crowned queen. And these young women were being cared for by maids, and they were all led by this man named Haggai, who was a eunuch. Now, for those of you who don't know what a eunuch is, let's just say he was no longer distracted with his lust for the women. And so he was able to focus and pay attention to the young women without any other desires or distractions. Okay. And so in Esther chapter 2, verse 9, it says, the girl pleased him and won his favor. And I know for me, the first several times I've read this passage, I just glossed right over the fact that she pleased the guy and maybe the maids who were taking care of her. But the fact that this woman, who up until now was only known for her beauty, pleased and won the favor of a eunuch, it speaks volumes of her and her character. He wasn't interested in her sensuality like the other men in the empire. He might have been able to acknowledge that she was a beautiful woman, but beyond that, he didn't really care. It didn't control him. And he was able to see beyond that and see some substance in the character of Esther. He's able to see something much deeper than her physical appearance. And listen to the words here in verse 9. It says, she pleased him and won his favor. And the Greek words for that mean, for the Greek word for won his favor means gained, or she took kindness of his favor from him. And that's an interesting word choice because it's an active verb. It suggests she does something in the gaining, right? She won it. She took it from him. It required an intentional effort as opposed to just finding favor in his eyes. Like she just trips over something and woo, he has found favor in her. But there's something about her, the way she presented herself, the way she interacted with him, that actually won that favor from him. Gaining kindness was something that she did rather than something that was just done to her. And I think for some of us, sometimes that little girl fantasy part of us just comes out and we want to make a fairy tale out of the book of Esther. You know, a beautiful young woman is just whisked away from poverty or from nothingness into the palace, and she gets to become the queen, and she and the king live happily ever after for the rest of their lives. And we make it such a romance story, but really that's not what the scripture says happened to Esther. In verse 8, it says that Esther was taken to the king's palace. That makes me think less of Cinderella and more of the movies Taken 1, 2, and 3, right? Against her will, against her desire, she was ripped away. And I can't imagine how she felt about that. She was literally taken from everyone she knew. She was taken from her family, from people who loved her, from her friends, from her community, and brought to the palace. And these young women that were brought to the palace, they didn't volunteer to go. They didn't sign up like we sign up for American Idol to see if we can win. They were taken because of their beauty and because the king or his men saw something in them physically that they desired. And so she's ripped away from her people just to be beautiful. And she's brought to the king along with hundreds of other women. She's brought to the king to be beautiful so that hopefully on an occasion, maybe one occasion, maybe a couple occasions, for the rest of her life, she can be taken to please the king. What a sad future to look forward to. That's not a fairy tale romance. The majority of these young women who were taken to the palace in order to try to become the queen, they faced a future of relative isolation. They wouldn't marry. Only one would marry the king, and the rest would stay in the palace. In the harem, they wouldn't marry, they wouldn't have children, they wouldn't have families, and they'd have no interaction with their old friends or family from before they were taken, because the king's harem had absolutely no interaction with anyone outside of the palace. What a lonely, isolating life these women signed up for. And while she might wanted to have curled up in a ball and just tried to pretend it wasn't happening, or maybe she wanted to just to blend in with the other women and be insignificant so that nothing could make her special or noticed and she could maybe just kind of slip by. She didn't do that. There was something active that she did, or something about her that openly exuded from her character that ultimately won the favor of Haggai, the eunuch. And the Bible doesn't tell us what that is, but it is something intriguing to think about, isn't it? What, aside from beauty, could have made Esther remarkable? Well, drawing from my own life and interactions I've had with a wide variety of people, I can tell you that there are some people that have made some amazing, long-lasting, positive impacts on me. And there are some people really who haven't. And I think ultimately for me, what it's boiled down to over the years is some people have people skills and some people don't. Let's just be honest. And now as a disciple, I can say that those who have the biggest impact on me, not just do they have people skills, but they have godly people skills. They're godly people. People who exude the character of Jesus. People who are cultivating the fruits of the Spirit. People who are allowing the Word and the Spirit to continue to transform them and more into the likeness of Jesus. Those people have an impact on me. We don't know what it was for Haggai and Esther. And let's keep reading in Esther 2, verse 15. Second half of that verse says, and Esther won the favor of everyone who saw her. Okay, just as she was, beauty, no beauty, she won the favor and the admiration of everyone who saw her. And that included women. So it's rare to find a woman who is so beautiful that all the men admire her and who also is favored by women. You know, think about it. Women who are beautiful tend to be really disliked by the rest of us, aren't they? We compare ourselves to them. We don't want them to get ahead. We don't want to like them. We want to pick apart everything we can to think of how maybe she's not as amazing as she seems to appear to everyone else. Esther might have looked beautiful to a man, and that might be what got her into the palace, but her looks would not have gotten her to have everyone who saw her in awe and admiration of her. It would not have helped everyone to think favorably of her. So she must have had a demeanor that the women liked. There must have been something else other than her beauty that caused them to like her and not dislike her, especially given such a competitive environment. All these women, they're struggling, they're competing to try to be the next queen. And yet there's something about this woman in the midst of the competition that they are able to find pleasing. And you know how we women can get, right? We can get catty, we can get competitive, we can be distrusting. You get enough of us around each other and we're starting to not feel good about each other. We start putting each other down so that we can start feeling better about ourselves. Then there's the gossip and the slander that starts flying around, but not with Esther. There was something about her that made everyone like her. What was it? And again, we don't know. The scripture doesn't tell us. But for me, I just thought of a few things that really draw me to other women. You know, some women are just endearing. And you find yourself, you just can't help yourself. You just like them. They're just endearing and sweet. I love women who are humble. Women who listen. Listen when I speak as though it's important to them and it's of value to them, and they treasure my thoughts and my feelings that I share with them. Women who are a pleasure to lead, who are submissive, who are compliant, women who are trusting and trustworthy. Those are just a few of the things that I think about when I think of what women really draw me to them. I want to share my screen with you and share a couple scriptures that came to mind as well as I was putting this together. You know, there's a lot that we can read in the Proverbs that really tell us how to interact with each other and how, what it is that makes us appealing before God. I think first of all, this Proverbs 9:10 says, the fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom, and knowledge of the Holy One is understanding. And I think for so many of us, what makes us attractive is our wisdom. It's our knowledge. And, you know, beauty is fleeting and all of that. And maybe if you're one of those young ones who are gifted with incredible beauty, that's amazing. That might go away though. And what you really need to hang your hat on is our wisdom and our understanding that can only come from the Lord. Now, I love this one. This doesn't tell us what makes us pleasing in other people's eyes. This tells us what doesn't make us pleasing in God's eyes. And certainly none of these things make us pleasing in other people's eyes. There are 6 things the Lord hates, 7 that are detestable to him: haughty eyes, a lying tongue, hands that shed innocent blood, a heart that devises wicked schemes, feet that are quick to rush into evil, a false witness who pours out lies, and a man who stirs up dissension among brothers. And I got to agree with God. I don't like those. I don't like pride. I don't like lying, wicked schemes. No. Stirring up dissension. Those will get you other kinds of reactions from people than winning favor. Here we have a couple more. Maybe we have a couple more. Oh, here we go. Proverbs 10:8. The wise in heart accept commands, but a chattering fool comes to ruin. And I'm sure many of us can think about times we've spent with people that are chattering about foolishness and tying themselves up in just foolish knots. And it's just not pleasing to spend time or have conversation with. Proverbs 10:9, the man of integrity walks securely, but he who takes crooked paths will be found out. We're attracted to people with integrity. Proverbs 11:16, a kind-hearted woman gains respect, but ruthless men gain only wealth. Kind-hearted. That's something that sometimes today is a rare treat. Just a couple more. Proverbs 11:22, like a gold ring in a pig's snout is a beautiful woman who shows no discretion. Discretion is essential in our relationships with each other. Proverbs 13:3, he who guards his lips guards his life, but he who speaks rashly will come to ruin. And finally, Proverbs 17:27, a man of knowledge uses words with restraint, and a man of understanding is even-tempered. And there's a couple there for us. Using our words with restraint, thinking before we speak. And then for those of us who are tempted to not have such great self-control, being even-tempered and having some self-control. Okay. Esther had some people skills. Let us never underestimate the power, the importance, the impact of God-driven people skills. Something caused her to stand out amidst the hundreds of beautiful women, pampered, trying to be the prettiest that they could possibly be. And I suspect that some of these people skills, these godly people skills, are part of what it was. All right, let's keep reading. In Esther chapter 2, verse 17, we've already read this. Let me read this to you in the New American Standard Version. I like the way this one reads. It says, the king loved Esther more than all the women, and she found favor and kindness with him more than all the other virgins, so that he set the royal crown on her head and made her queen instead of Vashti. Okay, so King Xerxes could have had any woman he wanted. And he could have had the most beautiful woman in the entire empire to be his queen. And maybe he did. Maybe that was Esther as well. Maybe she was the most beautiful woman in the empire. But maybe, just maybe, there was something more to this new queen than just her beauty. He had an entire harem of beautiful concubines, but he wasn't looking for a concubine. He is looking for a wife and a queen. And I suspect that after night of entertaining some shallow, beautiful women, he began to look for something more. And that's what Esther had, something more, something that intrigued him. And finally, the scripture says here that she found favor with him. She found kindness with him. And this Hebrew word for kindness, it expresses a graciousness, a connection, a blessing that comes from a very close and intimate relationship. Esther had something else with King Xerxes. He wasn't just infatuated with her beauty. He ultimately was able to love her for something deeper than her beauty. She had a way with people, and she won the admiration of everyone who saw her. The king, the eunuch, the women, everyone who saw her. Point number 2, she was obedient and took advice. And so a few times here throughout chapter 2, we've noticed that Esther gets input. Sometimes she asks for input, sometimes she just receives input. Esther 2 verse 15 says, came for Esther, the girl Mordecai had adopted, the daughter of his uncle Abihail, to go to the king. She asked for nothing other than what Haggai, the king's eunuch, who was in charge of the harem, suggested. She listened. This man knew the king better than anyone else that she was around, better than any other woman in the harem, perhaps even better than any of the maids. Haggai knew what was important to the king, and she listened. She took his input, and she was humble. And I just think how many of the other women would have responded to Haggai like that? Perhaps he looked at them and said, "You look beautiful in this purple gown." And they said, "No, pink. This is what I want." Or he said, "Let's curl your hair like this," or put it in an updo. And she said, "No, like this," and argued against Haggai's suggestions. But Esther was humble, and she took his advice. And as a result, she won favor in the eyes of the king. In Esther chapter 2, verse 10, she was humble and obedient to Mordecai. Verse 10 says, she had not revealed her nationality and family background because Mordecai had forbidden her to do so. So as she's whisked off to the palace, she's listening to Mordecai, the man who has raised her, and telling her what to do. Amen. Well, then she becomes king during Esther chapter 2. And down here in verse 20, and we haven't read this yet, but Esther chapter 2, verse 20 says, but Esther had kept secret her family background and nationality, just as Mordecai had told her to do. For she continued to follow Mordecai's instructions as she had done when he was bringing her up. So here she is, the queen of the Persian Empire, one of the most powerful people in the empire. She's still listening to the guy that brought her up, still humble, still obedient to the input and the direction that she received from Mordecai. Let's move on just a little bit to Esther chapter 4. We'll see even some more humility she has with Mordecai. Verse 12, we talked about this the first time we looked at Esther. But in verse 12, it says, when Esther's words were reported to Mordecai, her words being, I'm not going to the king, it's too dangerous, I can't fight for the lives of the Jews. When these words were reported to Mordecai, he sent back this answer. Do not think that because you are in the king's house, you alone of all the Jews will escape. For if you remain silent at this time, relief and deliverance for the Jews will arise from another place, but you and your father's family will perish. And who knows but that you have come to royal position for such a time as this. Then Esther sent this reply to Mordecai, "Go, gather together all the Jews who are in Susa and fast for me. Do not eat or drink for 3 days, night or day. I and my maids will fast as you do. When this is done, I will go to the king, even though it is against the law. And if I perish, I perish." So Mordecai went away and carried out all of Esther's instructions. Wow. Esther valued the advice and the input of Mordecai, of his urging for her to go to the king, even at the potential risk of her own life. She valued it, and she was humble and obedient to it, even at the risk of her life. Now, I know it is not popular today to talk about advice, right? It's not popular to talk about being obedient. It's not popular to talk about seeking advice. It's not popular to talk about taking advice. But it's still popular with God. The Proverbs are full of passages that urge us to seek and take advice. And I'll share my screen with you again. And we have just a couple more passages from the book of Proverbs for this evening. Proverbs 11:14. For lack of guidance, a nation falls, but many advisors make victory sure. I remember really wrestling over that passage as a young disciple, thinking about my need to get many advisors to make victory sure in my own life. And yet, God says it's important. Proverbs 12:15, the way of a fool seems right to him, but a wise man listens to advice. And I've learned so many times over the years, oftentimes the hard way, that I'm following the way of the fool, the way that seems right for me. But it would be much better, much wiser if I just got and listened to some advice. Proverbs 13:10, pride only breeds quarrels, but wisdom is found in those who take advice. Again, I want to be a woman of wisdom, not a woman of pride and quarreling. Proverbs 15:31-33, he who listens to a life-giving rebuke will be at home among the wise. He who ignores discipline despises himself, but whoever heeds correction gains understanding. The fear of the Lord teaches a man wisdom, and humility comes before honor. When I read that, I mean, so many parts of that convict me, but just that last sentence, how often I look for honor. I want honor before I'm willing to be humble. And obviously that never works. And finally, Proverbs 19:20, listen to advice and accept instruction. And in the end, you will be wise. Amen. I get it. All advice is not good advice. And some advice comes at us even when we're not looking for it. But it's still important to God. I've gotten good advice. I've gotten bad advice. I've taken advice. I've disregarded advice. I've been grateful for advice. I've been really frustrated at some advice and resentful of advice that I've received. I've received so much unsolicited input and advice at different points in my life, I couldn't even process all of it. But the bottom line is humility is important to God. Seeking advice is important to God. Taking advice is important to God. God values the open heart, the heart that's open and receptive to advice. God values the heart that's obedient and not obstinate. God values the heart that's easily led and not belligerent. We don't always have to be independent. We don't always have to be right. We don't have to be contrary and unique. And I think some of us value that, our individuality, our contrariness, I don't know if that's a word, our contrariness, our uniqueness. Some of us value that more than we value what the scriptures say about following advice. Maybe that's in the church for you. Maybe you struggle with getting it or taking advice within the church, within your spiritual relationships. Maybe it's at work with your bosses or your coworkers, and you just want to know what's right and what's best and make your own decisions. Maybe it's in our families. with our spouses. Oh, yes, we can seek input and advice from our spouses. That's often a really great source of input and advice. And from our parents. I realize that some of you younger ones, your parents aren't smart yet because you haven't reached 30, but they are smart and you'll get there and you'll be grateful when you do start listening to some of their advice and their input. Esther sought advice from Haggai and she followed it and it served her well. She received advice, unsolicited advice, and some advice that she really didn't want from Mordecai, and she followed it. And it served her well. And some of us need to consider seeking and taking advice and watching that go well with us as well. All right. Point number 3, she turned to God for help. We just read that in Esther chapter 4, when Mordecai tries to persuade her to go to the king and she relents. She goes to God. And sure, Esther didn't want to. Esther wanted to pull the covers up over her head and pretend that everything was going to be okay. She wanted to pull the covers up and hold on to that last bit of hope that she had and just wait it out. But she didn't. And yes, her first response to Mordecai was, no, I'm not going to do it. It's too dangerous. Don't ask me. I'm not going to do it. But she didn't stay there. She allowed herself to be persuaded by Mordecai. And when she was ready to push past her fear and act, she did. But the first thing that she did was to call an empire-wide 3-day fast for herself and all of her people. She prayed, and all of the Jews of the Persian Empire at her direction prayed and fasted and inquired of the Lord. And I think that's so important. You know, she didn't act. Once her mind was made up that she was going to obey what Mordecai had asked her to do, she didn't act. She didn't devise plans. She did nothing until she had spent 3 days fasting and praying and inquiring of the Lord. And God delivered. And I think many of us need to be reminded to go back there, to turn back to God for help. And I know Ryan talked about that a few Sundays ago, that sometimes we're just tempted to rush in and go forward with our own plans and our own strength and our own intelligence, or maybe the advice we did get from somebody else. It sounded good. Let's rush ahead and do it. But we need to remember to slow down and to seek counsel of the Lord, because it's his plans that prevail in our lives. So point number 3, she turned to God for help. Let us turn to God for help. And finally, finally, she was shrewd and diplomatic. All right. So let's look at just a couple more passages quickly. Esther chapter 5, verse 1. It says, on the 3rd day, Esther put on her royal robes. This is after she's just now fasted and prayed. Now she gets up and gets dressed. Esther put on her royal robes and stood in the inner court in the palace in front of the king's hall. The king was sitting on his royal throne in the hall facing the entrance. When he saw Queen Esther standing in the court, he was pleased with her and held out to her the gold scepter that was in his hand. So Esther approached and touched the tip of the scepter. Then the king asked, "What is it, Queen Esther? What is your request? Even up to half the kingdom it will be given to you." "If it pleases the king," replied Esther, "let the king, together with Haman, come today to a banquet I have prepared for him." "Bring Haman at once," the king said, "so that we may do what Esther asks." So the king and Haman went to the banquet Esther had prepared. As they were drinking wine, the king again asked Esther, "Now what is your petition? It will be given to you. And what is your request? Even up to half the kingdom it will be granted." Esther replied, "My petition and my request are this. If the king regards me with favor, and if it pleases the king to grant my petition and fulfill my request, let the king and Haman come tomorrow to the banquet I will prepare for them. Then I will answer the king's question." Let's move ahead to chapter 7, verse 1. So the king and Haman went to dine with Esther. As they were drinking wine on the 2nd day, the king again asked, "Esther, What is your petition? It will be given you. What is your request? Even up to half the kingdom it will be granted. Then Queen Esther answered, if I have found favor with you, O king, and if it pleases your majesty, grant me my life. This is my petition. And spare my people. This is my request. For I and my people have been sold for destruction and slaughter and annihilation. If we had merely been sold as male and female slaves, I would have kept quiet, because no such distress would justify disturbing the king. King Xerxes asked Queen Esther, who is he? Where is the man who has dared to do such a thing? And Esther said, the adversary and enemy is this vile Haman. Amen. Wow. And just look at the way Esther pulls all of this together. She's so patient. She's not rash. And I think of how I might have wanted to handle it. The king lets me come to him and I just want to blurt it all out. Here's what happened. Here's what he did. Here's what he said. Here's what now what's going to happen. Fix it, fix it, fix it. Like maybe I do sometimes when Ryan walks in the door. No, I try not to do that sometimes when Ryan walks in the door. But that's not what she did. She was patient and not rash. She was self-controlled. She was planned. She was shrewd. You know, the Bible tells us in Matthew 10 to be shrewd as snakes and innocent as doves. It's okay to be shrewd. And she was humble. Everything about her in her interactions with the king were so deliberate. Her clothes, she could have gone to the king dressed any way she wanted. She was his wife, and part of her represented that when she showed up before the king. But she was also the queen of Persia, and she dressed herself on behalf of the people as the queen of Persia when she went to the king. She appealed to him not just as a wife, but as a queen. Her timing, again, she wasn't rash when she first spoke with him. She invited him to a dinner. It wasn't the right time. She invited him to another dinner. She chose the proper time to speak with the king. Her setup, her speech, she appealed to him with humility. If it pleases the king, please, king. She appealed to him with dignity, with respect, with humility. And then she appeals to him as his wife. Someone is coming after me, your wife. And then in that shrewd statement allows him to take on the act for himself, to take on the stopping. How dare somebody? Maybe they can go after the Jews, but how dare someone go after my wife? And she began to make it personal. There's so much about the way Esther appeals to the king that is shrewd and diplomatic. It is thought through. It is contemplated. It is planned. It's deliberate. And I think many of us as well can learn in our interactions with each other to be that, to be more diplomatic, to be more planned and cautious and deliberate and not just rash in coming out with our emotions and what's going on with us. Certainly none of us have the emotion to such a degree that Esther had as she was fighting for her life and the life of the Jews. So hopefully you've gained some insight tonight into some of the characteristics of Esther that made her more than just a pretty face, and something that you can take, something that you see in your own character or something you'd like to see in your own character as well that you can imitate from Queen Esther.